Hello and welcome to my channel. I am Andrea and this is Beyond the Pink Door. So a few weeks ago I was talking about sewing plans and I mentioned that I'm going to make some tank tops or vest tops, and I mentioned the free pattern from Itch to Stitch, which is called the Lago tank, and I had a lot of people just message in the comments to say, when I'm making one, would I do a sew along? Now I would never have thought of doing a sew along, to be perfectly honest, because I would have thought this was a very simple top. But a few people said that they struggled with putting on the neck and arm bindings. So I thought, well, okay, here goes. So if you like watching sew-alongs, watch along. I'm going to make one up. I'm going to tell you about the pattern first. Number one, it's a free pattern from Itch to Stitch. It comes in a really good size range. I've screenshotted here on my phone, so it goes from 00 up to size 20, and the 00 starts with a bust of 31 and an eighth, a waist of 25 and 3/8, and a hip of 33 and an eighth. And then it goes up to size 20, which is bust 46 and a quarter, waist 40 and a half, and hips 48 and a quarter. Now I've decided, according to the measurements here, that the size 6 is going to fit me well, and that is a bust of 36 and 5/8, a waist of 30 and 7/8, and a hip of 38 and 5/8, and that's actually pretty much my size. So it describes it as a relaxed fit. I've made one already and I found it's a really nice fit. So it's got a lovely scoop neck here at the front, and it's actually quite a high back on it, which I really like because a lot of tank tops have a scoop in the back as well. And what I find then is that the straps keep falling down because I've quite droopy shoulders. So I end up with bra straps falling down and I end up with tank top straps falling down. So I really like the high neck, so it's really comfortable to wear. It's got 4 pattern pieces. It's got a front piece, a back piece, and it's also got bindings. So this is the part that I really like about it. So you don't just tuck in and hem around, you get a binding on it, and that's actually really comfortable to wear. So I've cut out my pattern pieces. I've made one alteration to it because I've made one already and I found it quite long, so I've shortened it up in the length. There's a length and a shorten line here, which is around the waist. Initially I folded up 2 inches there, but I ended up with a really weird shaped top, and you'll see that there's a bit of waist shaping there. Not a lot, but there is a little bit, and when I folded it up it ended up a very strange shape. So instead I folded up down here, and then the front piece, the front hemline is slightly dipped here at the front, and I didn't actually like that, so I just straightened that off, and it's only about 1 centimetre. I find this pattern is really good for those pieces of fabric that you have in your stash. So if you've maybe bought 2 meters of a jersey because you liked it and you thought maybe you'd make like a little wrap dress or something, and then you decide to make a t-shirt and you've got this odd kind of less than a metre piece left over, these are really good. So the one thing I would say is to be careful of your jersey. So you can make it out of cotton jersey. I've made one out of modal, really comfortable, lovely out of bamboo, really nice and drapey, really good from viscose jersey as well. You could possibly make it from French terry if you wanted it like a little bit more snugly. It has lots of instructions on it, and the important part on it is she has got these lines to say to use this on the greatest amount of stretch on your fabric. So with cotton jerseys you don't always have the same stretch in the width as the length. Now I found with this one that I cut out, I actually cut it in the length, so I did test to make sure that I had just as much stretch. So this was a very odd piece of fabric I had left over, and I folded into the selvage. I folded in the selvage, I cut my back out, cut my front out, and then the bit that was left in the middle, I literally cut my neck band and my armhole bands, and they've worked out really nicely. Now if you don't have the same amount of stretch on the length and the width, you need to cut everything out with all your pieces along the width, because that's where you normally have your greatest amount of stretch. So it also says on the instructions or on the pattern pieces that the seam allowance is 1 centimetre, and I really like the fact that it's written on the actual pattern piece, so I don't have to go back to my PDF and try and find it, and it's always not always there very easily to find. So it is, yeah, 1 centimetre, and I'm going to sew it. Yeah, 1 centimetre seam allowance on the bindings as well, just checking that. I'm going to sew it with my sewing machine, and I'm going to use my overlocker to finish the edges. So I'm going to unpin my pattern pieces and get started, and angle my camera so you can see what I'm doing. So a few lovely little details here about the pattern is on the front there's a little notch here on the armhole. The notch is a full centimetre long, so it gives you an idea of your seam allowance. So I've cut my fabric, I've just done a little snip in through my fabric, and it's about 1/3 of the way in through the notch. On the back there's 2 notches, so again on my fabric I've cut 2 little notches. And then on the armhole binding you can see there's 2, there's one here for the shoulder, and then there's one here for the front. So really handy. So when it comes to putting on the armhole band, it's just a matter of matching up all the notches. And it's the same on the neckline as well. Here's your centre front, so I'm going to mark my centre front on my binding, and then here we go, 2 more as well, just for your shoulder, and then this is your centre back. Now the first thing I'm going to do is the shoulder seam. So here's your back neckline, here's your shoulder seams. What I'm going to do is move my shoulder, my front piece over, and I'm going to sew from here to here. So you can see that I'm not lining up my shoulder seam exactly, because if I do, then when I get to the edge of my 1 centimetre seam allowance seam, I'm stopping here, and then I've gone over here, so there's no fabric underneath. So just offset it slightly and just check that this length here is 1 centimetre, and then I'm going to sew from here to here, and I'm going to do the same on the other side. And while I'm doing that, then I'm going to get my armhole bindings and my neck binding, and I'm going to sew them as well. I'm going to sew the seam, so that's 1, 2 and 3. So I'm just going to sew them with my zigzag stitch, and I'm not going to overlock the edges on the binding because that's going to be inside, but I am going to overlock the edge of my shoulder. So these are my shoulder seams done, and I have sewn them, overlocked them, and I've pressed them towards the back, and then you can see how the edges are all lining up with the armhole and the neck hole. So the first thing I'm going to do is, I love my new pin cushion, just saying, I'm going to actually put the neck binding on before I sew the side seams because I just find that easier. So I've put a little notch here for the back neckline, and I'm going to line up my seam on my neck binding and pin that, and then I'm going to get the center of my neck binding, and I'm going to pin that to the center notch of my tank top. And then of course I have a notch along here in my binding, and that is for the shoulder seam. So I'm going to match them up. And the same on the other side. There's my shoulder seam, and then there's my notch. And then I'm going to put another pin just along here, and then in the gap here as well. I'll put one there. I have pins of all varying shapes and sizes. So now I'm going to bring this to my sewing machine, and using the 1 centimetre seam allowance, I'm going to start here at the centre back, and I'm going to sew around. Now you can put lots more pins if you like. Personally, this is enough for me. So I'm using a zigzag of 2 in width and 2 in length, so it's an even sized zigzag. You can use your stretch stitch if you please. I don't actually have a built-in stretch stitch on this sewing machine that I like, so I always use my zigzag. So I'm setting up the edge of my fabric here with the line on my sewing machine plate that shows me 1 centimetre, and then I'm going to sew all along. So I'm not starting with a back stitch because I'm sewing in a tube, and I will just overlap my stitching line when I come back to the beginning. So what you want to do is be very careful that you don't stretch your neckline out, that you stretch your binding to fit your neckline rather than trying to gather your neckline to fit your binding. So keep your neckline flat and stretch out your binding without overstretching it. Make sure when you come to your shoulder seam that the shoulder seam goes back and doesn't flick forward. And again, just gently stretch out your binding. And if you have lots of pins in, just sew pin to pin, take it easy. We're halfway around. I'm making sure that my binding is staying in line with the edge of my neckline. And that's that. So I'm going to overlock my edge, and then I'm going to press my binding around with my iron. So there's my binding on and pressed, and it pressed really nice and flat. What you can do is you can do a zigzag here if you like, or a twin needle. When I've mine finished, I will do I'll do some cover stitch sewing around the edge there because I have a cover stitch machine. You'll get the same effect with a twin needle if you want to use it, or you can just leave it like that if you like. One tip I will give you is that if you're afraid that your binding is not going to be even all around, then try out doing one like this where the fabric is the same on the binding and the neckline, and when you're really happy with how you're doing, then you could use a contrast one. But a contrast fabric will show if you've got a little bit more wibbly wobbly. This looks pretty good. So the next thing I'm going to do now is I am going to go and put my 2 side seams together, so right side together, front and back, and I'm going to do my seam from the armpit down to the hem. So I'm going to sew down there with my 1 centimetre seam allowance with my zigzag again. and I am going to overlock it and press it towards the back, and then we'll do the armhole binding. So here we are with our side seams done, and I have my armhole here ready. Without even looking at the top, I know that this is the back because there's a double notch, single notch, here's our side seam, and here's our shoulder seam. I've got my armhole binding and I have folded in half, pressed it, and I've actually put pins in where each of my notches are. So here's my underarm seam, here's my double notch, here's another single notch which is for the shoulder, and here's the single notch for the front. So really your hands are really held to make this top because all these notches are like putting part of a jigsaw piece together. So I like to have my top like this inside out and put my binding into it. So I'm going to start with matching up my underarm seam. Then I'm going to move on to my shoulder seam. Then I have my single notch here and my single notch on my front armhole. And I'm going to match up my double notch here to the double notch at the back. And then, like the front, I'm going to put another pin where this gap is. So I'm stretching out my binding and then I'm walking along. Just roll that back out. And I'm going to do the same here on this piece from the single notch up to the shoulder. Just stretch out the neck, stretch out the binding, and then put another pin there. I'm going to do the same now for the other armhole as well, and then again I'm going to start at the underarm and sew around with my zigzag and then overlock. So I'm here at my underarm and side seam. I've got my seam here pushed towards the back, and I'm going to put the edge of my fabric along my 1 centimetre line here, and again, like the neckline, stretching out my binding to fit my armhole. Now I've got my bindings on both armholes and I've got them overlocked, and what I've done is I've ironed one and not ironed the other, because I think what happens to a few people, and this is why I've been asked to do this sew along, is that when you put on the binding and you look at it you go, oh god, that doesn't really look very good, that looks like really puckered and it looks very pulled and it can look like that, and you don't think that that's good enough, and you think, oh, that's going to look really, really bad. But the thing is, it looks like that until you get out your iron and you give it a good press, and then you press it and it looks like this, and it looks perfect. So I know that some people will say, oh, I can't be bothered plugging in my iron and ironing as I go, but you know what, it's actually false economy with your time. In my opinion, I always turn on the iron, turn on the sewing machine, and I'm ready to rock and roll. And I find that if you sew your seam and then you iron it, it looks so much neater and it's so much easier to get on with the next step. So if I didn't have this ironed, for me to cover stitch this or zigzag it or to twin needle it, it would be a bit of a fight because I would have to keep kind of curling the seam to the inside, whereas when it's ironed, it's just really easy. You just zip around it. So it's so much easier. So don't look at your seams and think, they don't look very good, they don't look very even. They will look perfect once you have ironed them. So I am going to press the other seam, the other armhole now, and then I'm going to press up a hem. I'm going to cover stitch around all of the edges, and then my tank top is done. So there we go, all finished on my mannequin, all nice and flat. I find this top really handy for the summer with shorts, and I also find it a great like layering up option during autumn and winter and into spring. So if I'm wearing a blouse like this, I'll always be wearing some sort of a top underneath it. This is a ready to wear top, but I'll definitely be making some of these in plain colours, and I will possibly use a plain binding. It all depends on what fabrics I have. So again, a great stash buster. Like the length of it when I've shortened up the pattern. And yeah, I don't know what else to say about it really. If you did ask about me doing this sew along, I hope you found that helpful, and I hope I answered some of your unanswered questions. And if there's any questions, just pop them below into the comments and I'll try and help you as much as I can. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this little sew along, and I will see you in another video soon. Bye for now.